Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
Today we're tackling something a little different. Economic sanctions. Are they this tool of peaceful diplomacy as they're often portrayed, or...
Or is there something else going on?
Exactly. Our main source material is Andranik Aghazarian's book, Cold War 2.0, Dawn of the Asian Millennium. We'll be focusing specifically on the sections about economic sanctions and trade wars.
Right. And what Aghazarian does really well is he brings in all these different perspectives so we can get a more well-rounded understanding of this complex topic.
Totally. So let's jump right in. The book starts off with this really powerful quote from Noam Chomsky.
Oh, yeah. This one really makes you think.
He says, and I'm quoting here, "The number of people killed by the sanctions in Iraq is greater than the total number of people killed by all weapons of mass destruction in all of history."
Wow. So right off the bat, Aghazarian is challenging us to rethink our assumptions about sanctions.
Absolutely. It's not just some abstract policy tool. It has real-world consequences, often devastating ones.
And that leads right into the two main viewpoints that Aghazarian presents.
Right. You have the critics who argue that sanctions are often misguided and ineffective.
And they cause immense suffering, especially for ordinary citizens.
Then on the other side, you have the supporters who believe they are a necessary and effective tool of foreign policy.
It's like this constant push and pull between these two sides.
And to really illustrate the potential human cost of sanctions, Aghazarian brings in this thought-provoking analogy from Jacob Hornberger.
Oh, yeah. In this 2017 report, Hornberger poses this really tough question.
He asks if sanctions lead to widespread suffering and death.
Are they morally equivalent to bombing a country?
It makes you really grapple with the ethics of it all.
Definitely. Because if you're causing that level of harm, are you really any different from a country that's using military force?
And to further examine this question of effectiveness, Aghazarian dives into these case studies of North Korea and Cuba.
Countries that have been under some form of sanctions for decades.
Right. And despite these sanctions, we haven't really seen any major regime change in either country.
Instead, the sanctions seem to have primarily just hurt the everyday people.
It's like this tragic cycle where the people who are already struggling end up bearing the brunt of these policies.
And speaking of tragic,
yeah,
perhaps the most disturbing example Aghazarian includes is Madeleine Albright's response when asked about the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children under sanctions.
Oh, yeah. This is that quote that just stays with you.
Her response was, "The price is worth it."
Just chilling. And it really connects to this idea of the banality of evil that Aghazarian explores.
Right. It's this idea that these large bureaucratic systems can dehumanize people.
And it makes it easier to commit or justify these horrific acts.
Because it all just becomes routine. You lose sight of the individual lives that are being impacted.
And what's even more concerning is that the targets of these sanctions seem to be expanding.
It used to be that sanctions were primarily used against developing nations.
But now the U.S. has increasingly been using them against allies like the European Union.
It's like this economic weapon that's being wielded more and more liberally.
And the sheer number of sanctions is pretty staggering. According to Aghazarian, as of May 2020, the U.S. had 32 active sanction programs targeting various countries.
Wow, 32. That's a lot.
Some of these programs date back to the 1950s.
So it's not just a recent phenomenon. This has been going on for decades.
And this overuse of sanctions is a major point of criticism in a report called "The World Must End the U.S. Illegal Economic War" by Kevin Zeese and Margaret Flowers.
They argue that these sanctions often amount to economic terrorism.
And that's a term that's also been used by Venezuelan Ambassador Samuel Moncada when he was criticizing U.S. sanctions.
It seems like there's this growing resistance to this unilateral use of economic power.
You're right. Aghazarian mentions that China and the Group of 77, which represents 134 developing nations, have called for international condemnation of these sanctions.
So it's definitely not just a fringe view.
But if there's all this controversy surrounding sanctions, it really begs the question, are they even effective?
Right? Like if they're causing all this harm, are they actually achieving their intended goals?
To try and answer this question, Aghazarian turns to Richard N. Haas's analysis of the effectiveness of sanctions.
Haas is like the seasoned diplomat. He's got a lot of experience in this realm.
And in his analysis, he lays out 8 key observations about sanctions.
Yeah, like, for example, he points out that sanctions often fail to achieve these major foreign policy goals.
Especially if those goals are really ambitious or if they require quick results.
Right, it's not like you can just snap your fingers and get a regime to change its behavior.
A prime example of this is the failure of sanctions to get Saddam Hussein to withdraw from Kuwait.
Right, that's a case where sanctions just didn't have the intended effect.
Haas also highlights that unilateral sanctions are rarely effective.
Especially in today's globalized economy.
The target country can usually find alternative sources of trade and financing.
It's like trying to plug one hole in a leaky bucket.
But perhaps the most important point that Haas makes is about the unintended consequences of sanctions.
Yeah, this is where things get really messy.
They can harm innocent civilians, destabilize entire regions, and even backfire by strengthening the very regimes they're meant to weaken.
They're like this double-edged sword.
And Haas offers some really compelling examples of this, like the sanctions in Haiti and the former Yugoslavia.
Where these sanctions tragically led to mass displacement and actually worsened the existing conflicts.
That's a sobering thought, isn't it?
Definitely.
Yeah.
And on top of all this, there's the issue of lifting sanctions.
Haas points out that it's much easier to impose sanctions than it is to remove them.
They often outlast their intended purpose, becoming this source of resentment and instability long after the original conflict is over.
It's a really complex issue with no easy answers.
Yeah, and it's not getting any easier as countries are finding ways to circumvent these sanctions altogether.
Aghazarian points to a recent event as evidence. In May 2020, Iran successfully supplied Venezuela with fuel, even though both countries were under heavy U.S. sanctions.
It seems like the old rules of economic warfare are being rewritten.
Right. And Aghazarian also talks about the growing use of cryptocurrencies by countries like Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea.
As a way to evade financial controls.
So it's like this whole new layer of complexity is being added to this already complicated issue.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And while we're on the topic of countries finding ways to get around sanctions.
It seems like a natural segue into Aghazarian's second major theme, trade wars.
Right, because even when sanctions aren't completely effective, they still create all these new problems and tensions.
And that can lead to these tit-for-tat economic retaliations.
Exactly, which is where we see the trade war come into play.
Yeah, and when we talk about trade wars these days, I mean, the big one that comes to mind is the U.S. and China.
Right, it's like this economic rivalry that's been brewing for years.
Exactly. And Aghazarian really puts this in perspective by talking about this idea of the Chinese century.
Yeah, China's been on this incredible economic rise since like 1978.
And now a lot of experts think they're on track to overtake the U.S. as the world's biggest economy.
It's a huge shift in global power. And Aghazarian presents two pretty contrasting perspectives on this whole rise of China thing.
Okay, lay it on me.
So first he looks at Martin Jacques' book, When China Rules the World, which explores this whole idea from the Chinese point of view, like how do they see their expanding global influence?
Interesting.
And Jacques argues that China's rise could actually lead to like a more multipolar world where power isn't just concentrated in one nation.
So a more balanced global order.
Yeah, potentially. But then Aghazarian brings in Michael Pillsbury's book, The 100-Year Marathon.
And what's Pillsbury's take?
Well, Pillsbury's a former U.S. defense official, and he's got a very different view. He sees China's rise as a threat to American interests.
Okay, so we've got two very different narratives here. One that sees China's rise as potentially positive, and one that sees it as a threat.
Exactly. And this tension is further fueled by forces like globalization and protectionism.
Right, because globalization led to all those Western companies shifting production overseas.
Which meant cheaper goods for consumers, but also job losses and economic decline in the West.
And that's where Donald Trump's 2016 campaign comes in.
Oh, yeah. He really tapped into that resentment and frustration.
With promises to bring back American jobs and fight for fairer trade deals with China.
And as president, he definitely followed through on those promises with tariffs on Chinese goods, accusations of unfair trade practices.
It was a very confrontational approach.
But as Aghazarian points out, this whole situation is way more complicated than just a simple trade war narrative.
Right. It's not just a case of China bad, America good.
Exactly. And Aghazarian challenges this idea that China is solely to blame for the U.S. trade deficit.
Which is a common narrative you hear a lot.
He brings in some big-name economists like Martin Feldstein, Joseph Stiglitz, and Yukon Wang to kind of dismantle this myth.
So what are they saying?
Well, for instance, Feldstein argues that a country's trade balance is ultimately determined by its own domestic policies, not just by the actions of its trading partners.
So it's not all China's fault.
Not necessarily. Stiglitz makes a really interesting point, too. He says that the U.S. trade deficit is largely due to low national savings, excessive government spending, and a consumption-based economy.
Meaning we just spend more than we save as a nation.
Right. And he even says that if Trump really understood economics, he would have focused on increasing national savings instead of starting a trade war.
So it's like this whole different way of looking at the problem.
Exactly. It's about looking inward. instead of just pointing fingers outwards.
So where does that leave us then? Is there a way out of this escalating trade war?
Well, Aghazarian does offer a glimmer of hope. He highlights this argument from Noma Barr in his Economist article.
And what's Barr's take?
She says that the U.S. should allow China to rise peacefully and focus on cooperation, especially when it comes to shared challenges like climate change or global security.
So more of a collaborative approach.
Exactly. And the IMF kind of echoes this sentiment. They suggest that China should take a leading role in defending the global trading system.
And work towards resolving disputes through established mechanisms like the World Trade Organization.
Right. It's about finding ways to work together instead of constantly butting heads.
But is that even realistic given the current state of tensions?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to Aghazarian's credit, he doesn't pretend to have all the answers. But he does end this section with a pretty stark warning about how fragile this whole situation is.
Yeah, he uses that powerful image of the dogs of war being unleashed.
It's a reminder that even seemingly small actions can have these huge unintended consequences.
And it leaves us with this really thought-provoking question. Can the U.S. adapt to a multipolar world where it's no longer the sole superpower?
That is the question. And I think even asking that question shows a willingness to at least consider new ways of thinking about the world.
To move beyond those old Cold War mentalities.
Exactly. Because the world is changing, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
And that's a tough one, right? I mean, it really challenges our assumptions about America's role in the world.
It does, because for so long, the U.S. has been this dominant force.
Sole superpower.
Exactly. So to even contemplate a world where that's not the case,
it's a huge mental shift.
It is. And that's the question that Aghazarian leaves us with, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can the U.S. actually adapt to a multipolar world?
And I think even just asking that question is a good first step.
Like, it shows a willingness to at least consider different possibilities.
To challenge those old ways of thinking.
Exactly.
Because the world is changing whether we like it or not.
It is. And we can either try to cling to the past,
or we can try to adapt and evolve.
And I think that's the ultimate message here.
That we need to be more open to change.
More willing to see things from multiple perspectives.
And more willing to cooperate with other countries, even those we might see as rivals.
Because in a world as interconnected as ours, our fates are intertwined.
What happens in one part of the world inevitably affects us all.
So we really need to start thinking more globally.
And less about just our own narrow self-interests.
Because at the end of the day, we're all in this together.
We are.
So for those of you listening out there, we encourage you to keep exploring these issues.
Keep asking questions.
Keep challenging your own assumptions.
And keep the conversation going.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for us, and we hope it's been the same for you.
We've learned a lot.
And we hope you have too.
So thanks for joining us on this journey.
And remember, if you can't be good, be careful.